Hello everyone and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. The night had fallen heavy around us, the world outside swallowed by the black expanse of the countryside. Jack and I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly ahead, winding through the desolate landscape like a snake. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a constant companion to our silence. We didn't speak much, just the occasional comment about how much longer it would be until we reached our destination. The last stretch of road had been empty, the kind of isolated stretch where the only thing visible was the occasional flicker of distant headlights. It was supposed to be a spontaneous road trip, a break from the monotony. We'd packed our bags and hit the road without much thought, hoping the adventure would break the dull routine of our daily lives. But the deeper we drove into the countryside, the more I started to feel it, that creeping sensation of being watched, the unsettling whisper of something wrong lingering at the edges of my thoughts. It was as if the night itself had grown too thick, pressing in on us, closing us off from the world we once knew. As we turned another sharp curve, something unexpected came into view, a forgotten relic from another time. The flickering lights of an old drive-in theater, overgrown with ivy, its broken marquee barely visible in the dark. The screen, enormous and looming, cast a faint glow that beckoned us in. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like we were being drawn in, like the place itself had been waiting for us. Jack didn't seem too thrilled about the idea, his brow furrowing as he glanced at the crumbling structure, the wreckage of something once loved but now forsaken. Yet, something about it intrigued me, compelled me to stop and take a closer look. "Let's just pull in for a bit," I said, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. "Maybe we'll find something interesting." Jack hesitated but didn't protest. I turned the wheel, pulling off the road and onto the gravel lot. The tires crunched beneath us, the sound hollow in the stillness of the night. The air had grown colder, the atmosphere charged with an eerie energy as we parked beneath the faded glow of the screen. At first, everything felt normal, eerily normal. The old ticket booth stood abandoned, the glass cracked but still intact, as though someone had just left a moment ago. The rusted remains of a concession stand sat dark and silent, while the giant screen flickered as if struggling to stay alive. But there was something unsettling about it all, an unnatural stillness that clung to the air like an invisible presence. I glanced at Jack, who seemed to be studying the surroundings with growing discomfort. "I don't like this, Amy," he muttered, his voice tight. "This place feels off. Let's just get back in the car and go." But I didn't respond. I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward. The glow from the screen pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing me in, beckoning me to witness something just beyond my reach. I reached for the door handle, but as my fingers brushed the cold metal, I stopped. A faint static buzzed in the air, and then, unexpectedly, the screen blinked to life. At first, it was just a random assortment of grainy images, a flicker of trees, a flash of headlights. It looked like some old, forgotten film reel. Then the images sharpened. And there we were. Jack and I froze. On the screen, there we were, our faces, our clothes, everything exactly as we looked at that very moment. It was impossible. We hadn't seen anyone around. But there we were, in the middle of the screen, standing in front of the car just like we had minutes ago. The film played on, slowly and eerily, as if it were some dark mirror of reality. My breath caught in my throat. Jack was silent, staring at the screen, his hand gripping the armrest of the car, his knuckles white. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I watched the version of us on screen begin to move. Our on-screen selves stepped forward, their expressions twisted in ways I couldn't explain. We watched as our film counterparts began to argue, their voices distorted, their movements exaggerated as if they were puppets on a string. Jack's voice broke the silence. "What is this?" "Amy, this is us. This is us." I nodded, too terrified to speak. The movie on the screen seemed to be getting more personal, the argument between the two of us escalating. It was as if the film was showing us things that hadn't happened yet, things we hadn't even said aloud. The version of Jack on screen was shouting at me, accusing me of things I didn't remember doing. And the version of me, was crying, pleading, just as I had done days ago in a fight we'd had. The words were sharp, cutting through the night air like the echo of some long-lost memory. "Jack," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't right. It's like it's reading our minds." But before he could answer, a shadow moved across the screen. The images on the screen suddenly shifted, and a figure emerged. A man in a dark trench coat, his face obscured by the brim of a wide, tattered hat. He stood still, watching us through the screen, and I felt a chill seep deep into my bones. It was as if he were waiting for something, waiting for us to react. Suddenly, the man on the screen began to step forward. Slowly. Deliberately. As if he were moving through a different plane of existence, crossing from the realm of the film into our reality. My heart raced in my chest, and I glanced at Jack. His eyes were wide with terror, and his lips were moving, but no sound came out. The man on the screen stopped at the edge of the frame, just beyond the boundary of what should have been the movie world, his eyes locked onto mine. "Amy," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. This isn't real, right? We're dreaming." But I didn't have the answer. Because I wasn't sure anymore. I turned the key in the ignition, praying for the car to start, but it only sputtered. Nothing. The engine died with a hollow, pitiful sound. Panic shot through me. I tried again. Nothing. The headlights flickered and went out, and we were plunged into darkness, save for the pale, flickering light of the screen. Then I saw them, figures, emerging from the trees. Figures that shouldn't have been there, but were. They were shadows at first, only the faintest outlines in the corner of my vision. But as they drew closer, I could see them more clearly, strange, contorted figures that looked like people, but not quite. Their faces were stretched and distorted, their bodies jerking and twitching unnaturally, like broken marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. "Jack. Jack, do you see that?" I stammered, my breath catching in my throat. He nodded, his eyes wide with terror. "I see them. I see them." The figures were coming closer, moving with eerie precision toward the car, their hollow eyes fixed on us. They were whispering now, too, though their voices sounded muffled, distorted, like they were speaking through a layer of thick glass. "Amy. Jack." The words echoed in the stillness of the night. "Come with us." I screamed, slamming my hand against the door, but it wouldn't open. It was stuck. I tried again, frantically pulling at the handle, but nothing would budge. The figures were almost at the car now, their faces twisting into grotesque masks of agony. I could see it clearly now, each one of them was a distorted version of someone I knew. A version of me. A version of Jack. But the most horrifying part was the man on the screen. He had moved from the edges of the frame, stepping into the center, his face no longer obscured by his hat. His smile stretched unnaturally wide, and I realized with sickening clarity, he wasn't just watching us. He was us. I could feel him, his presence in my mind, his thoughts invading my own. The darkness around us seemed to close in, the whispers growing louder, until I felt as though I was drowning in them. The car lurched. The figures reached the windows, their hands scraping at the glass, their breath fogging up the windows. Their voices called out to us, familiar yet foreign. Then, everything went black. The screen died. The figures disappeared. And I was alone in the dark. The silence that followed was absolute, an eerie stillness that seemed to smother every sound in its suffocating grip. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm of it echoing in my ears as I sat frozen in the dark, hands still clutching the steering wheel, my breath shallow and frantic. The world outside the car was now completely obscured. The cold, oppressive air pressed against the windows, as if the night itself had grown denser, wrapping itself around us like a suffocating blanket. Jack's voice broke through the silence, trembling and hoarse. "Amy, are you okay? Are you still?" But he didn't finish the sentence. His voice trailed off, and I could hear the panic rising in his tone. I turned to look at him, but he was staring at the windshield, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't look at me, not directly. He was staring past me, beyond me, through the glass of the window, into the darkness outside. I followed his gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. There, standing just beyond the car, was the man from the screen, the one who had been watching us. His dark trench coat flapped slightly in the wind, but it was his face that held me in place. It was the same twisted, grotesque smile I had seen in the movie, stretched unnaturally wide. His eyes were empty, hollow, two black pits that seemed to pull everything in. I felt a coldness seep into my bones as I realized that he wasn't just standing outside the car. He was right there in front of us, no longer confined to the screen. "Don't look at him, Amy!" Jack cried, his voice panicked, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. My body felt frozen, my limbs heavy as if bound by invisible chains. The man's smile widened impossibly, and his mouth opened slightly, but no words came. It was as if his very presence was enough to paralyze us. For what felt like an eternity, we remained motionless. Time seemed to bend around us, as if reality itself had been distorted by the movie, by whatever force had lured us into this place. I could feel the pull of the screen, the pull of the figures, as if the entire night had been scripted long before we ever arrived. Then, in a sudden, terrifying movement, the man began to step closer to the car, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette yanked by invisible strings. His footsteps were muffled against the gravel, but I could feel each one in my chest, vibrating through the car. "Jack," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What do we do?" But Jack was no longer responding. His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale, his mouth agape as if he couldn't breathe. He was looking past me now, his gaze fixed on something beyond the windshield, his face frozen in disbelief. And then, slowly, his hand lifted, slowly, as if weighed down by an unseen force. His fingers pressed against the glass, trembling. A soft whisper escaped his lips. "Amy, it's too late." Before I could ask him what he meant, I saw it. The figures, those grotesque, contorted shapes, had returned. They were now emerging from the trees, slowly crawling toward us, their unnatural movements sending waves of dread through my body. They surrounded the car, their distorted faces pressed against the windows, their eyes staring through at us, wide and hungry. Their hands scraped against the glass, their fingers twitching like they were eager to reach inside. And then it happened. The car lurched forward, as if pushed by an unseen hand. The wheels screamed against the gravel, and I slammed my foot down on the brake, but it was no use. We were moving, inching closer to the screen, the glowing, flickering screen that seemed to pulse with life, pulling us toward it like a magnet. "Stop! Stop the car!" Jack shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the rising noise, the static, the growling hum of the screen, the whispering voices. It was all too much. Too overwhelming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The man outside the car moved closer, his grin stretching impossibly wide, and then, just as we reached the edge of the screen, everything stopped. The world went dark. The car was no longer moving. The figures vanished. The whispering ceased. The static on the screen went silent. And there we were. The car was parked, and we were sitting inside, staring at the screen. But this time, it was different. The screen showed us, Jack and I, sitting exactly where we were now. In the car, staring back at the screen. It was as though we were watching ourselves from the outside, trapped in a loop we couldn't escape. I turned to Jack, my voice trembling, but when I opened my mouth to speak, no words came out. My body was stiff, my thoughts foggy. Jack, too, seemed to be caught in the same paralysis. His eyes were wide with terror, his lips parted as if trying to scream but unable to make a sound. And then, the man on the screen moved. Slowly. Deliberately. He stepped toward us, his grin never faltering, his eyes black and hollow. And as he reached out to touch the screen, everything went black. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the sound of a single, breathless whisper, "Welcome to the show." The next morning, the drive-in was gone. The gravel lot was empty, as if it had never existed. The screen, the figures, the man, all vanished, leaving nothing but an overgrown field behind. Jack and I drove away in silence, but deep down, I knew, we were never meant to leave. And we never would. The night was thick and suffocating, like a heavy blanket draped over the world. I had been driving aimlessly for what felt like hours, my car's headlights cutting through the void of an unfamiliar countryside. The road stretched endlessly before me, each turn and twist leading me further into the unknown. My GPS had long given up, its screen now nothing more than a useless black void, and my eyes burned with fatigue. I had hoped to find a small town, a place to rest, to ask for directions, but there was nothing. Just the occasional faded sign, a rusted fence, and fields that seemed to stretch into eternity. Just as I was about to give up hope, I spotted something in the distance, a flicker of light, an old neon sign barely visible through the mist. The words "The Forgotten Drive-In" blinked in and out of existence, the letters so faint I almost doubted my eyes. A drive-in theater. It seemed out of place in this forgotten part of the world, but I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was a place to stop for the night. Maybe I could find some rest here. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under my tires, and parked beneath the eerie glow of the flickering sign. The place looked deserted, like something frozen in time, but something about it called to me. I stepped out of the car, my legs aching from the long drive, and stared at the towering screens ahead. They were cracked, warped with age, but they stood there still, as though waiting for something, waiting for me. The air smelled musty, like rotting wood and rust, and the wind carried a faint chill. I looked around, but there was no sign of life, no ticket booth, no concessions, no other cars parked. Just silence, thick and heavy, as if this place had been forgotten by the world for decades. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. A part of me wanted to leave, to drive away and forget this place ever existed. But I was tired, and there was something oddly inviting about the glowing screen. The thought of stretching my legs and maybe watching a movie to pass the time seemed like a small comfort, something to distract me from the loneliness of the road. I couldn't help but feel a strange compulsion to stay. I slid back into my car and reclined the seat, gazing up at the screen. It flickered again, and then, without warning, a distorted image began to appear, grainy and out of focus. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The image seemed like an old VHS tape, scratched and warped with age, the colors faded and uneven. A scene from a movie, maybe from decades ago, from a time when the drive-in was alive and well. But then, something strange happened. The image began to sharpen, the sound crackling into life. I watched, captivated, as the screen revealed an empty, decaying house. Shadows flitted across the walls, and the air seemed thick with something unspoken. There was no dialogue, no background noise, just the unsettling silence of a place abandoned for years. And then, I saw it. A figure stood at the doorway of the house, outlined by the dim light spilling from within. The figure was wearing the same clothes I was, the same jacket, the same worn boots. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me, my face, my posture, my movements. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure on the screen turned, slowly walking toward the camera, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something wrong with it, something distorted in the way it moved, like it wasn't quite real. The way it tilted its head, the hollow expression in its eyes. It was me, but not me. A version of me from some twisted future. A sense of dread settled over me, and I looked around the parking lot again, my gaze drifting to the other cars parked in the shadows. But there was no one in them. No one but the faint, glowing outlines of what appeared to be figures, silent, still, and watching. They sat in the cars, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their faces barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move. They didn't blink. But they were there. Watching. I turned back to the screen, my breath shallow, my pulse quickening. The figure on screen was now inside the house, the walls cracked and rotting. It moved through the dark rooms, its steps slow and deliberate. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every instinct in my body screamed for me to leave. The figure on screen stopped in front of a shattered window, looking out into the dark abyss. It was still, as if waiting for something. Or someone. Suddenly, the camera zoomed in on the figure's face. And then it grinned. A horrible, twisted grin. The grin stretched too wide, the mouth too large for a human face. It was an unnatural smile, one that didn't belong. And then, I saw it. The eyes. Empty. Hollow. Black. Before I could react, I heard a sound. A low whisper. It was coming from the figures around me, the ones sitting in the cars. Their mouths were closed, but the sound came anyway, soft, unintelligible murmurs, like an endless chant. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the weight of them in the air. The tension thickened, and a sense of urgency began to crawl over me. I scrambled to open the car door, but it was stuck, as if something unseen was holding it shut. I tried again, panic rising in my chest, but the door wouldn't budge. I looked back at the screen. The figure in the house had moved closer, the camera following its every step. And then, to my horror, I saw the same figure, myself, turn toward a door at the end of the hall. It opened. A figure stood there in the shadows, an outline too vague to make out. But it was there, waiting. The version of me on the screen stepped forward, but then, without warning, the door slammed shut. I jumped at the sound, my breath caught in my throat. The figures around me were moving now. Not fast, but with an eerie, deliberate slowness. Their eyes glowed brighter, their faces twisted, their hands reaching out toward me. They whispered in unison now, their voices more distinct, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the depths of my mind. "We've seen it. We've all seen it," they chanted. "Your death is written, just like ours." I turned back to the screen, the image now distorted beyond recognition. The figure on screen was no longer me. It had become something else, something monstrous, its face twisted and contorted in agony. And it was moving toward the camera, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The air grew heavy, as if the very earth was alive and waiting. My car began to shake, the windows rattling violently, and I looked around in terror. The figures in the cars were rising now, their bodies shifting unnaturally. Their eyes locked onto mine, and I could see them clearly now, pale, hollow faces, their expressions frozen in perpetual terror. I tried the door again. It was useless. My hands shook as I reached for the keys, the engine roaring to life in a futile attempt to escape. But then, I heard it, a loud cracking sound, as if something massive had broken. I turned to see the screen crack and splinter, the image warping. I watched, horrified, as the figure in the movie, the twisted version of myself, stepped forward. And as it did, something shifted. The shadowy figure on the screen was no longer a character in a film. It was me. Standing at the edge of a cliff. I felt a pull in my chest, a sinking sensation, as though I were being drawn toward the abyss. The wind howled outside, the world blurring with shadows. And I saw it, clearer than ever before. The figure in the movie took a step forward. And so did I. I was falling. The car jerked violently as if the ground itself was breaking apart beneath us. The figures around me were no longer still. They were screaming, no, they were howling, their mouths open in a silent frenzy. And then, in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just a movie. It was a warning. The same fate that awaited them would soon be mine. I watched as the figure on the screen, the twisted reflection of me, fell into darkness. And then the ground beneath me gave way. The last thing I heard was the deafening sound of the wind and the whispers of the forgotten, as I, too, was consumed by the void. The world went black. I felt the cold rush of air, the sensation of falling, the grip of something unseen pulling me down into the endless abyss. But then, as if waking from a nightmare, everything stopped. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't in my car anymore. I was standing on the edge of the same cliff I had seen on the screen. The air was thick with mist, and the ground beneath my feet crumbled away in jagged, uneven edges, leading into an abyss of swirling blackness. The wind howled around me, its cold fingers tugging at my clothes. I staggered back, my heart racing, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How had I gotten here? The answers came, not in words, but in the heavy, suffocating silence that enveloped the scene. The figures, the ones I had seen in their cars around me, now stood around the cliff's edge. They were just like me now, pale, hollow, their eyes wide and empty. Their expressions were twisted in terror, frozen in time, just like the ones on the screen. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but not with fear. No, it was something else. It was a realization that sank deeper into my bones than any fear could reach. This was it. The horror I had seen on the screen had not been some twisted fiction. It had been a prophecy, a vision of what would come. A glimpse into the inevitable. My death. The way I would meet the abyss. The whispers began again. The same voices I had heard, those chilling murmurs that had echoed from the figures around me, now filled the air, growing louder, more distinct. "You are one of us now," they whispered, their voices empty and hollow. "You can never leave." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move, as though the ground had already claimed me, as if it too had become a part of the cursed fabric of this place. A figure stepped toward me, one of the shadowy forms. It moved like the others, slow, deliberate, its face hidden in darkness. As it came closer, I saw something that froze my blood. The figure raised its head, and in the faint light, I recognized it. It was me. A twisted, contorted version of myself, just as I had seen on the screen. The eyes were black, empty pits, and its mouth stretched into that horrible, grotesque grin. It reached out, its fingers curling like claws. "You've seen it now," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo of my own. "This is where we all end." The darkness around me began to close in, a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to fight. But I was trapped, bound to this cursed place, just like the others who had come before me. I turned, searching for any escape, but there was none. The cliff's edge was all that remained, a void of nothingness. I was standing at the precipice, watching as the shadows swarmed closer, their faces twisted, their voices rising in a cacophony of horrors. And I knew. I had become part of the forgotten. The drive-in had been their prison. And now, it was mine. The screen, now invisible in the void, flickered once more in my mind. And as I fell, just as the figure on the screen had, I knew one thing for certain: there would be no escape from this cursed place. The forgotten drive-in had claimed me. And I would never leave. It was supposed to be an easy drive. Just a quick trip home, taking the back roads through the countryside to avoid the busy highways. The kind of drive where you could let your mind wander, where the world feels distant, quiet, almost serene. But somewhere between the winding paths and the darkened trees, something shifted. I hadn't noticed it at first, just a car behind me in the distance, far enough away that I thought nothing of it. It was late, nearly midnight, and the emptiness of the road gave me a sense of solitude. It was peaceful. But as the minutes dragged on, the peace began to crack, like a thin layer of ice ready to break. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The headlights of the car, distant at first, were now closer, too close. I should have kept my eyes on the road, but a strange, nagging feeling had started to settle in my stomach. Something was off. And then, it started following me. It wasn't just behind me, it was tailing me. The headlights were unwavering, a constant glow that never seemed to lose ground, no matter how many turns I took. I told myself it was just another traveler, someone on the same lonely road. People drove these back roads all the time, especially at night, when the highways were too crowded, too noisy. But something didn't feel right. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. The road was winding and narrow, with thick trees lining both sides, casting long shadows over the pavement. I took a sharp turn, then another, trying to lose them in the curves, but every time I checked the rearview mirror, the headlights were still there, just behind me, never wavering. My palms began to sweat, and I felt a tightness in my chest. This was ridiculous. It was nothing, I told myself. It had to be. I was just overreacting. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The car wasn't just following me, it was tracking me. As if it knew exactly where I was going, exactly when to change lanes, exactly when to match my speed. No matter how many times I tried to shake them off, they were always there. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears now, the rhythmic thumping mixing with the roar of my engine. I glanced at the speedometer, 80 miles per hour. Too fast for these twisty roads, but I couldn't care less. The car behind me was closer now. Too close. I made another sharp turn, my tires screeching against the pavement as I tried to control the car. When I looked up again, the headlights were so bright I could barely see the road ahead. A flash of panic shot through me. I had to get away. I had to lose them. But the car stayed glued to my rear bumper, as though it had merged with my very shadow. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911, but just as the call went through, I hesitated. What was I going to say? I didn't even know who was following me. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm, too calm. I could feel the words I wanted to say sticking in my throat, like they were trapped somewhere deep inside of me. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's following me, I blurted out, my voice unsteady. I don't know who they are, but they've been behind me for miles. I can't lose them. Where are you located? The dispatcher asked, her tone still calm, even as I felt the terror mounting within me. I'm on Highway 12. Near the old theater, I said, my eyes darting around the empty road. I think they're getting closer. Stay calm. Help is on the way. Just keep driving. I ended the call, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The car was still there, and now it was getting closer. My mind raced. What if this wasn't just some random driver? What if they were after me? I looked at the road ahead. The theater wasn't too far off, just a mile or so up ahead. It was an old, run-down place that had been abandoned for years. Maybe there would be people there, maybe I could find safety. I pushed my foot down on the gas, my car roaring as I sped down the dark road. The headlights of the car behind me blinked, then blinked again. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. What did they want? Why wouldn't they leave me alone? As I approached the theater, I could make out the outline of the building through the dark. I took the turn into the parking lot, my tires crunching over the gravel. The lot was nearly empty, just a few rusted cars left behind, their windows cracked and their paint peeling. But I didn't care. I just needed a place to stop, a place where I could breathe for a second and figure out what to do. I parked near the back, as far away from the theater as I could, trying to put some space between myself and whoever was following me. My hands were still shaking as I turned off the engine. I sat there, staring ahead, my breath shallow, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I tried to calm myself. This wasn't real. I was just overthinking everything. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. The car behind me was just a coincidence. I could go inside, wait for the police to arrive, and everything would be fine. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of another car door opening. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't know if I could move, if I could bring myself to turn around. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to drive away, to get as far from this place as possible. I risked a glance in the side mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The car from behind me was parked right next to mine. The headlights had gone dark, but the car was still there, sitting in the same spot as mine. My breath caught in my throat. My hands were stiff on the steering wheel as I turned my head, my eyes scanning the interior of the car in a desperate search for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. There was someone sitting in the back seat. A figure, slumped forward, their face obscured by shadows. But I didn't need to see their face. I didn't need to know anything more than what I already saw. They were staring at me. Their eyes, dark and unblinking, locked onto mine, sending a chill straight through my spine. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my ears, and I fought the urge to scream. I knew I should drive away. I knew I should get out of here. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. It was like I was frozen, locked in place by the unholy weight of their gaze. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. They weren't moving. They weren't blinking. They just sat there, their eyes never leaving mine, watching, waiting. And then, before I could even process what was happening, the figure shifted. Slowly, like they were standing up in the back seat. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel them. I could feel the shift in the air around me, the presence growing closer, as if they were coming for me. I snapped out of my trance, the panic flooding my chest, and before I knew it, I was driving again. I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas, my tires spinning on the gravel, my mind racing as I sped out of the parking lot. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could barely hear the roar of the engine. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, the image of those cold, unblinking eyes stayed with me. And no matter where I went, I knew deep down, I would never be able to forget the feeling of being watched. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly I thought my knuckles might snap. The sound of the tires on the road felt like an anchor to my sanity, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still with me. I looked in the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing. No headlights, no car, just the empty road stretching behind me into the dark. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that I was safe. That the nightmare was over. But then my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I jumped, startled by the sudden sound. It was a message. Asterisk, are you okay? Asterisk, it was from the dispatcher, the one I'd spoken to earlier. I stared at the screen, my stomach dropping. I hadn't heard sirens. I hadn't seen any police cars. How did they know? Before I could respond, another text came through. This one was different. Asterisk, don't look behind you. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as a chill settled over me, colder than the night air. My pulse quickened, and against all rational thought, I slowly turned my head. In the dim reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure. A person. Not in the back seat of my car, but standing in the middle of the road, just behind me. Their face was obscured by the shadows of the night, but the outline of their figure was unmistakable. And they were watching me, standing motionless, just a few feet away, as though waiting for me to notice them. I slammed my foot down on the gas, my mind spinning, my pulse a rapid drumbeat in my ears. I didn't dare to look back again. I couldn't. The image of that shadowy figure burned into my mind, and I drove faster, desperate to outrun whatever it was. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't focus. My entire body was trembling with the overwhelming urge to get away, to escape. I didn't stop driving until the sun started to rise, until the darkness began to retreat and the road ahead was bathed in pale light. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. When I finally pulled into the nearest gas station, I didn't even care if it was open or not. I parked the car and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to steady my breath, to convince myself that I was safe now. The figure was gone. The car was gone. But the unease in my chest never fully disappeared. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, my heart still thundering in my chest. I was no longer alone in my car, even though I was. And I knew, deep down, that I would never truly escape whatever had been following me. Whatever had been waiting. It was supposed to be just another one of those things we did for fun, an adventure, an escape from the mundane routine of life. My friends and I had always been the curious type, the kind who ventured into forgotten places and searched for the stories hidden in abandoned buildings. We had heard about the old cinema on the edge of town, a relic from the 1940s, still standing among the overgrown trees and wild vines. The rumors had always intrigued us, stories about its abrupt closure, the strange and eerie aura that surrounded it. But it was just an old theater, right? Nothing to fear. We made our way to the outskirts one evening, excited by the idea of something new to experience. As we walked down the cracked path toward the building, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. The air had an unnatural heaviness to it, the sky above tinged with a bruised purple as nightfall began to creep in. I looked up at the faded sign of the Lakeside Theater, partially obscured by the entangled vines, and thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this place than we had anticipated. But we were already too far in to turn back now. What harm could an old, abandoned movie theater possibly hold? We pushed open the rusted doors, the sound of metal screeching against metal slicing through the silence. The air inside was thick and musty, carrying the scent of mildew and age. Our footsteps echoed as we stepped into the vast, darkened hall. The floor was covered in a layer of dust, and the once glorious velvet curtains were now tattered and stained. Old, faded movie posters hung crookedly on the walls, their edges curling, as though trying to escape the oppressive gloom. "Wow, this place is ancient," Jake remarked, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. "It's like time just stopped here," Sarah said, brushing her fingers over the back of a chair, leaving a trail in the dust. We wandered through the rows of seats, peering into the dark corners, trying to make sense of the faded remnants of a place that had been abandoned for decades. The smell of decay filled my nose as I ran my hand along the back of a chair, wondering what it had been like when this theater was bustling with life, when laughter and applause had filled the air. But now, it was just us. Silent. Alone. Then, as if on cue, a faint hum broke the stillness. We froze. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from somewhere inside the theater. The sound was low, almost imperceptible, but steadily growing louder. We turned toward the back of the theater where the old projection booth stood. "I didn't know there was still power in this place," Max said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Maybe it's just a generator or something," I suggested, though a chill ran through me. We made our way toward the source of the noise, my heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. As we approached the projection room, the flickering light from the projector became visible through the small glass window in the door. We stopped in our tracks, staring in disbelief. The projector was running, its old machinery creaking and grinding with a life of its own. "Did one of you turn this on?" Jake asked, his voice a little shaky. "No way," I said, shaking my head. "We didn't touch anything." But before anyone could say anything else, the projector clicked and whirred to life, the whirling sound growing louder as the screen in front of us flickered to life. The images on the screen were grainy, faded. The sound was distorted, muffled like a dream from long ago. It was an old black and white film, the kind you would expect to find in a dusty box in some forgotten attic. A scene played out in front of us, a ballroom, filled with people dressed in formal clothes, dancing to music that sounded like a distant, forgotten tune. "Whoa, check this out," Max said, his tone a little more relaxed. "This is like a time capsule." But I couldn't shake the unease in my chest. There was something off about it, something unsettling in the way the figures on the screen moved. They seemed too perfect, too controlled, too still. I tried to ignore it and sat down in one of the old chairs, my friends following suit. As we watched the film, I noticed something strange. The actors on the screen weren't just playing their parts. They were looking at us, their eyes tracking us, moving across the screen with unnatural precision. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just my imagination, right? But then, it happened. One of the figures, an elegantly dressed man with a top hat, stepped toward the edge of the screen and reached out. His hand came out as if he were extending it toward us, as if he could touch us. I gasped and stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you see that?" I whispered urgently. "See what?" Sarah asked, laughing nervously. "That guy on the screen, he..." But before I could finish my sentence, the figure in the film was right there. In the aisle. His face, pale and twisted in a grotesque, silent grin, was mere inches from me. His eyes, those black, hollow eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a chill spread through my bones. "Run!" I screamed. But it was too late. The others were already staring, mesmerized, their faces slack, their eyes glazed. They were watching the film as if in a trance, as if they couldn't tear themselves away. The figure grinned wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, he reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers cold and clammy, as if they'd been dipped in ice water. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to obey, caught between the world of the film and the world I knew. Then the others began to move, not of their own volition, but as if something was pulling them. The figures from the film, the ones who had been dancing in the ballroom, laughing in the shadows, began to spill from the screen. They were no longer just actors. They were real. Their skeletal fingers reached out, their twisted forms shuffling forward, dragging themselves out of the film and into the real world. I tried to break free, but my limbs felt like lead. I tugged at my arm, but the man's grip tightened. The others, they were changing. Their faces warped, their features twisting into monstrous versions of the characters on the screen. Their eyes, dark and hollow, no longer looked human. They were becoming part of the film. Part of the past. The walls of the theater seemed to ripple, the fabric of reality thinning. I could hear the hum of the projector, louder now, as if it were growing hungry, pulling everything into its fold. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the man from the film, his twisted smile inches from my face, whispering in my ear with a voice that seemed to come from every corner of the room. "Welcome to the cinema of the past." And then, I was no longer in the theater. I was part of the film. Forever trapped, watching the reel of my own nightmare spin endlessly before my eyes. The story of the Lakeside Theater became a whispered legend, something to send a chill down the spine of anyone brave, or foolish, enough to venture near the ruins. But no one who went searching for it ever returned. The theater itself, once crumbling and forgotten, was gone when authorities arrived to investigate the stories that had begun to spread. The trees had reclaimed the land, and where the cinema had stood, there was nothing but an empty plot, the echoes of a time long past lost to the winds. But every so often, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the faint hum of an old projector, an eerie whisper calling you toward the forgotten cinema of the past. Some say the film is still playing. I had always been drawn to the unusual, the hidden gems, the places people forgot or overlooked. I spent my days scouring old books, seeking out abandoned buildings, forgotten theaters, and the remnants of past lives. The thrill of discovery was a drug I couldn't quit, and nothing made my heart race like finding a place that had been lost in time. That's how I ended up in the middle of nowhere, in a place so remote that even my GPS struggled to find it. The road was rough, overgrown with vines and branches, a barely there path that seemed more like a suggestion than a route. But something in the air felt different that day, something whispered that this detour was worth taking. I had no idea that my curiosity would lead me to the edge of something ancient, something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The trees parted, and there it stood before me, hidden from the world, forgotten by time, an old theater buried in the woods. It was a place untouched by modernity, a relic of the past, and as I stepped inside, I had no way of knowing that I was about to become part of its twisted history. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it, a shift in the air, a strange weight pressing down on me. The silence of the forest seemed to intensify, and the distant sounds of wildlife faded away as if the theater itself had absorbed them. The smell of mildew and decay clung to the air, but there was something oddly comforting about it, like stepping into an old, forgotten memory. The grand foyer was large but eerily barren. The walls, once decorated with elegant tapestries, were now stripped of any color, their edges curling as if the wood and fabric had long since given up on holding their place in the world. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I ventured deeper into the room, my footsteps the only sound that seemed to dare break the stillness. The theater itself was just as decayed, yet still somehow magnificent in its desolation. The ornate red velvet seats were frayed and covered in dust, the golden railings tarnished with age. The stage was bathed in a faint light from an unseen source, as if the theater still longed to perform, even though no audience had sat in its seats for decades. The curtains, once rich and opulent, were now a dull brown, tattered and stained. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't turn away. My fascination with this place was too strong to ignore. The feeling of mystery wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I had to see more. As I stepped toward the projection room, an old film projector in the corner caught my eye. A faded sign on the wall read, *Tonight's feature, The Lost Ones. I couldn't resist the temptation. It was too fitting, too perfect for my tastes. I cranked the ancient machine, its gears grinding with effort as the film flickered to life. The screen in front of me came alive with black and white images of a bustling city street, a scene from a bygone era. The audience in the film clapped and cheered, their voices faint but distinct. It was a vintage film, something that must have been long forgotten, lost to time, just like the theater itself. I sank into one of the dusty seats, my eyes glued to the screen. The flickering light illuminated the theater's decaying interior, casting strange shadows across the room. The atmosphere was thick, almost heavy, and I found it strangely comforting. There was something about being here, in this forgotten place, that filled me with a deep sense of belonging. But then, as the film continued, that comfort began to slip away. The film began to warp, its grainy footage contorting in odd ways, blurring in places where it shouldn't. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as the images began to shift. The people in the film, once smiling and laughing, seemed to grow tense, their faces tight with worry. Their voices became unintelligible, distorted by the static on the screen. The scene changed, and suddenly, the film was no longer showing a city street, but a dark forest. The trees were twisted, their branches gnarled and contorted like skeletal hands reaching into the night. The faces of the actors blurred, their bodies growing more erratic, their movements unnatural. The camera panned over a dense forest, a place I could tell by the eeriness of the film was not far from here, if not right here. It was as though the trees outside the theater were creeping into the screen itself. The figures in the film began to scatter, running through the woods as if fleeing something just beyond the frame, their faces filled with terror. And then, I heard it. A sound, so faint I thought it was a trick of my mind at first. Footsteps. Soft at first, the unmistakable sound of shoes brushing against the floor. My heart rate quickened. I turned toward the aisles, but there was no one there. I looked back to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The actors on screen weren't running from the camera anymore. They were walking directly toward it, into the forest, their eyes wide and pleading. And then, one of them saw me, The woman, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes locked onto mine through the film. She didn't blink. Her expression was frozen in fear. And then, in an instant, the camera zoomed in on her face, and I could hear her voice. It was a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the projector, but it felt as if it came from right next to my ear. You shouldn't be here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembling. The voice wasn't from the film. It was real. The footsteps behind me grew louder. I jerked around again, my eyes scanning the dark aisles. No one. No sound except the growing beat of my heart in my ears. The room was empty, just like before. But the footsteps continued. I stood, my legs shaking, my feet barely able to hold me. I wanted to run, to get out of this place, but something, someone was pulling me back to the screen. The woman's face remained locked on mine, her expression becoming more and more desperate. Her lips trembled, forming words I could not hear. And then, they became clear. Get out. But it was too late. The film began to warp again, the faces on screen distorting into grotesque, twisted forms. The actors' bodies contorted as if they were being dragged into the woods themselves, their limbs snapping and twisting in unnatural ways. Their screams filled the air, but the theater itself seemed to swallow the sound, as though it were feeding on their pain. And that's when I saw it, the shadows moving in the aisles, creeping up the rows, slowly, deliberately. They were behind me. I could feel them. I turned to run, but the aisles stretched endlessly in front of me, the rows of seats shifting and closing off my path. The door, the exit, was no longer visible. The room had become a labyrinth, the shadows closing in, the whispers of the lost souls now filling my ears. I backed away, my breath quick and ragged. The footsteps followed, louder now, more insistent. The air had grown cold, suffocating, and the once familiar smell of decay was replaced by something darker, more oppressive. Something reached out from behind the screen. Something that had been waiting for me. I turned, facing the entrance, it was gone, the door had vanished. I was trapped. The figures from the film were moving toward me, the faces twisted in agony, their hollow eyes watching me, waiting. The last thing I remember was the woman's voice, no longer a whisper, but a scream. You should never have come here. And then, there was only darkness. When I woke, I was no longer in the theater. I was in the woods. The cold wind whipped through the trees, and I stumbled to my feet, my body sore and stiff. The remnants of the theater's decay were gone, replaced by the oppressive, unyielding forest that surrounded me. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious or how I had ended up here, but I could feel it, the unmistakable presence of something watching me. The woods felt familiar. I turned to look behind me, my pulse racing. Through the trees, I could just make out the faint outline of the theater, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring back at me. The whispers of the lost souls in the theater echoed in my ears once more. You shouldn't have come here. I turned away, my legs barely holding me as I stumbled deeper into the woods. And as I did, I realized something horrifying. I had never left the theater. I was still in it. It was one of those nights that felt heavier than usual, the kind where the fog rolls in thick and silent, swallowing everything in its path. The sort of night that seems to stretch forever, where the road before you feels endless and the world behind you feels like it's dissolving into the mist. I'd been driving for hours, lost in the monotony of the highway, trying to outrun the weight of my thoughts. The car's headlights barely pierced the darkness as I sped along the desolate country road, its eerie quiet broken only by the hum of the tires. It was a stretch of highway I knew all too well, one that I had avoided for years, ever since that night. But tonight, I had no choice. The town I had been headed to for some time was just a few miles away, and I had to keep going. I shifted uneasily in my seat, rubbing my hands together. The weather had been unusually cold, and the fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I pulled the collar of my jacket up and turned the heater up, but it didn't do much to ease the creeping chill in my bones. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight, and the road ahead felt eerily empty. The kind of emptiness that makes the mind wander, makes you start to question whether you're truly alone in the vast, fog-covered nothingness. My eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, catching my own reflection, a face that hadn't looked this tired in a long time. That's when I saw him. A figure, standing motionless on the side of the road, his silhouette barely visible through the heavy mist. He was a man, tall, unremarkable, but his presence felt out of place, like a shadow hanging on the edges of my vision. I slowed the car instinctively, my heart giving a small, nervous thud. A hitchhiker. I hadn't seen anyone in miles, and the road was deserted. My gut told me to keep going, to not stop for anyone, especially not on a night like this. But something about him made me hesitate, made me feel a strange sense of obligation. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been gnawing at me for weeks, or the fact that I hadn't seen a single car for the last hour. I rolled down the window, the cold air rushing in. "Need a lift?" I asked, my voice sounding much steadier than I felt. The man stepped forward, his eyes dark but steady as he looked up at me. There was an unsettling calm about him, something almost too serene. He smiled faintly, his lips curling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm just trying to get to the nearest town," he said in a low, gravelly voice, glancing around at the thick fog. "I didn't think anyone would stop. Most don't." I nodded, offering him the passenger seat. "I'm headed that way too. It's not far, I'll take you." He climbed into the car without a word, settling into the seat beside me with an ease that made me feel uncomfortable. He was dressed in a long, tattered coat, and his boots looked worn from a long journey. The scent of damp earth filled the car, along with something else, something metallic that I couldn't place. I drove on, the road ahead still shrouded in the mist, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the hitchhiker staring out the window, his face eerily calm, as if the fog itself had swallowed him whole. "So, where are you coming from?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "Does it matter?" I wasn't sure how to respond, but before I could say anything, he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're running away, aren't you?" The word struck me like a cold slap to the face. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my heart suddenly racing. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled again, though this time it was more knowing. You think you can outrun it. But you can't. I tried to shake off the unease settling in my stomach, but his words lingered, each one heavier than the last. What do you mean? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, his profile now almost ghostly in the dim light of the dashboard. The air in the car grew colder, though the heater was running, and a chill ran down my spine. I could feel his presence more than I could see it, a quiet weight that pressed on me from every angle. My mind raced. How could he know about me? How could he know that? The accident. The crash. The reason I had been avoiding this stretch of road for so long. I had tried to bury it, to move on, but now, here it was, creeping back in with the fog. My throat tightened, and I fought the sudden urge to scream. The last thing I wanted was to talk about that night. But he was staring at me again, his eyes burning into me. You were there, weren't you? He whispered, barely audible over the sound of the engine. You tried to help, but it was too late. My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know? I glanced over at him, my breath catching in my chest, but when I did, he wasn't looking at me anymore. His face had turned away, his eyes fixed once more on the fog outside the window. Stop, I demanded, my voice shaky. Who are you? But he didn't respond. The silence stretched, suffocating, until finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to him, intending to ask again, but when I did, he was gone. The seat beside me was empty. I slammed my foot on the brake, the car screeching to a halt. My hands shook violently as I stared at the empty passenger seat, my mind racing to make sense of what just happened. But there was nothing, no hitchhiker, no sign of him anywhere. Panic began to claw at me, and I glanced up at the rearview mirror, desperate to find something, anything to explain what I had just experienced. And that's when I saw it. His face. In the mirror, his reflection stared back at me. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted smile, but there was no body in the seat behind me. He wasn't in the car at all, he was only in the reflection. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as the world around me seemed to blur and spin. I twisted the wheel, my foot slamming the gas, and I sped off, the fog now pressing against the car like a living thing. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the reflection. It stayed there, locked in the mirror, its eyes following me with an intensity that felt suffocating. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. My hands were still shaking as I pulled into the first gas station I saw, heart still racing, my skin clammy. I couldn't remember the last few miles, couldn't even tell you how I'd gotten here. All I knew was that I needed to get out of that car. I didn't look back. I couldn't. And every time I pass a foggy stretch of road now, I swear I see his face in the corner of my eye. That hitchhiker, asterisk the phantom asterisk, waiting, watching. His reflection never leaves me. It's been months since that night, but the memory of him, the hitchhiker, the phantom, still lingers like a shadow I can't shake. I've tried to forget, to move on, but every time the fog rolls in thick and heavy, my heart races, my hands clammy, and I'm pulled back to that night, to the reflection that followed me. I haven't been able to drive that stretch of road again. The sight of fog, of the endless, empty highway, sends me into a panic, my mind replaying the image of his hollow eyes in the rearview mirror. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I stayed away long enough, the memory would fade. But it hasn't. I've seen things. Not just in my rearview mirror, but in the corners of my vision, in dark alleys, in crowds. That same, twisted smile. His eyes, empty and waiting. Sometimes, I think I hear his voice, whispering my name, a reminder of the thing I've tried to outrun for so long. I can't forget what he said to me that night, asterisk, you can't outrun it. Asterisk. And he was right. I tried. I thought I could leave it all behind, but the road, the fog, and the reflection, they never left me. They follow me, no matter how far I go, no matter how fast I run. Every night, I close my eyes and wonder if I'll ever truly escape. But deep down, I know that as long as the fog remains, as long as the highway stretches on, he will be there, waiting, watching, reflecting. And no matter how hard I try, I will always be haunted by the phantom passenger, the one who knew too much. The one who never truly left. The sky had turned a deep purple as we left the last small town behind, the streets growing more empty, more desolate. I glanced over at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, darting between the darkened road ahead and the rearview mirror, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It was strange how something so familiar, this drive we'd taken countless times, had suddenly started to feel so off. There was an unsettling chill in the air, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck rise, even though the temperature hadn't dropped yet. I don't know, Sarah muttered, almost to herself, her voice shaking. It just feels wrong. I reached over, gently squeezing her hand in an attempt to reassure her. It's just the quiet, I said. Maybe the isolation's getting to you. But as I said it, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. The landscape outside the car was swallowed by the growing night, the trees pressing in closer on either side, their dark forms looming over us. We were on a winding, narrow road cutting through dense forest, with only the sound of our tires on the pavement breaking the silence. The miles stretched on, the world outside the car swallowed by darkness, until I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights, glaring at us, too bright, too close. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing at Sarah. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart starting to race. "It's just another car," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew something wasn't right. There was no way that car could have caught up with us so quickly. We hadn't passed any other vehicles in miles. We both watched in tense silence as the car kept pace with us, maintaining a distance that was too consistent, too deliberate. Each time I accelerated, the car did the same, its headlights inching closer. "Maybe they're just going the same way," I said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. Sarah's grip tightened on the door. "No, it's too close." I took a deep breath and slammed my foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I pushed the car faster, but the other car matched us effortlessly, staying right behind us. I looked again, there was no sign of movement in the rearview mirror, just the headlights. No sign of a driver, no sign of anyone in the car at all. I felt my pulse spike, my breath quickening. "Okay, this is weird." I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel. The other car, of course, followed suit, its headlights reflecting off the wet pavement as it came to a stop a few feet behind us. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I opened my door, stepping out into the cold night air, my boots crunching against the gravel. Sarah hesitated, her face pale in the glow of the headlights. I walked around to the back of the car, glancing over my shoulder at the car behind us. It was still there, parked, but the headlights never dimmed. No one got out. No one moved. It was just sitting there, like a giant, unblinking eye in the darkness. I swallowed hard. "There's no one in the car, Sarah." "What?" she gasped. I turned to her, motioning for her to come outside. Reluctantly, she did, stepping cautiously onto the road. We both stood there, staring at the car. There was no movement, no sound, just the eerie stillness of the night pressing in on us. "You're sure?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my stomach turning. "It's just an empty car. There's no one behind the wheel." But as I said it, the headlights flared brighter. Almost as if they'd heard me, as if they were responding. "Okay, this is, no," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. "Let's just go. Let's get out of here. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. We both scrambled back into the car, slamming the doors behind us. I quickly started the engine, throwing it into gear, but when I glanced at the rearview mirror, my heart dropped. The car had moved. I hadn't seen it roll forward, but now it was just inches from our bumper, its headlights blinding in the mirror. "No." I breathed, pressing harder on the gas. But the other car didn't fall back. It just kept coming, right on our tail, its headlights never wavering. Every time I sped up, it sped up. Every time I slowed, it slowed. "Go faster," Sarah shouted, her eyes wide with terror. I pushed the pedal to the floor, the car flying down the road, but still, that car stayed right with us, its headlights always there, always in our mirror. I looked again. It was too close. "It's right behind us," Sarah screamed. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and something inside me froze. The car, it was closer, far too close. But there was something else. It wasn't just following us anymore. It was beside us, rolling along the shoulder, like it was waiting for the right moment to pass. I could see the shape of it out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned my head to look directly, it was empty. The driver's seat was vacant. There was no one inside. The car was moving on its own. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's no one in it." We both stared at the car, my hands trembling on the wheel. Without warning, the other car surged forward, its headlights flashing brighter as it came right alongside us, inching closer, as if it were about to crash into us. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding in my chest. The car behind us jerked to a halt just inches from us, then, nothing. It sat there, just waiting. No movement. No sound. "What do we do?" Sarah gasped, her voice broken with fear. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was stare at the car, a black void in the darkness. I had to get us out of there. I floored the gas again, tearing down the road, but no matter how fast I went, the car stayed with us. The headlights always in my mirror. Always too close. At some point, I don't know when, we must have lost the car, but the terror didn't fade. It never did. Now, I feel it behind me again. The relentless presence of that car, the one that was never driven by a person, but by something else. Something I still don't understand. All I know is it's still waiting for me. And I'm sure of one thing now, it's never really gone. We managed to make it to the nearest town, though I couldn't tell you how. My hands were numb on the steering wheel, my mind reeling from the impossible sight of that car, the way it had followed us, as if it were hunting us. We didn't stop to ask for help. We didn't even slow down. We just kept driving, faster than I'd ever driven before, until the familiar lights of the small town appeared like a beacon in the distance. I pulled into a gas station without even thinking, slamming the car into park. Sarah didn't move. Neither of us did. The air felt suffocating, thick with fear, and I could still hear the faint hum of the tires behind me, that constant, oppressive presence. Did we lose it? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking any louder would make it real. I didn't answer. I just stared at the empty road ahead. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. My heart raced, thudding in my chest, but the stillness of the town felt wrong, too quiet, too empty. And that's when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the gas station lot, a set of headlights flickered on. It was far away, almost too far to make out, but I knew. I could feel it. That same sense of dread I couldn't escape. I didn't need to see the car clearly. I knew it was there. I grabbed Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly, and she looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. We need to leave. Now, I said, my voice low, frantic. But as I turned to start the engine, the headlights grew brighter. Closer. That car, was still following us. Still waiting. I looked at the rearview mirror once more, expecting to see an empty seat, an empty car, but instead, I saw the unmistakable shadow of someone sitting behind the wheel. Their face was hidden, but I could feel their eyes, piercing through the dark. Watching. In that moment, I realized something that chilled me to the core. We had never truly escaped. As I slammed the car into gear, ready to flee again, I felt the weight of it, the truth settling in. The car wasn't following us anymore. It was waiting for us to make a mistake. It would always be there, in the dark, just behind us, always watching. Always waiting. And I knew we could never outrun it. It had become part of us. And no matter how far we drove, no matter how fast, it would never let us go. I had been traveling for hours, the endless stretch of road blurring beneath my tires. The sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills, the air warm but thick with the promise of dusk. I had no particular destination, just a vague sense of curiosity pulling me forward through sleepy towns and quiet country roads. The kind of place where nothing ever happened, and no one ever passed through, at least, that's how it felt. It was the perfect spot for someone like me, someone seeking the forgotten, the abandoned, the things that time had left behind. And then I saw it. Nestled at the end of a nearly deserted street, an old cinema stood like a ghost from another time. Its once proud marquee hung crookedly, half of the bulbs burnt out, and the paint peeling off the walls. The windows were cracked, some of them shattered, and the scent of age and decay lingered heavily in the air. The sign above read, "Silent Cinema," in faded red letters, and while the name alone should have made me hesitate, the peculiar pull of the place kept me going. I thought to myself, perhaps it was an old, run-down theater, maybe even closed down long ago. But there was something about it that seemed alive, something I couldn't quite place. As I walked closer, I saw movement inside, a faint, shifting silhouette through the grimy glass. I was almost certain no one else was around, but still, something tugged at me, urging me forward. I had to see it. The curiosity was too strong to ignore. I pushed open the heavy door, and the stale air hit me immediately, a strange mix of old popcorn, dust, and something colder, something more unsettling. The silence inside was overwhelming, the kind of silence that seems to stretch and compress all at once. No sounds of chatter, no rustling of wrappers, no faint hum of old projectors. The only noise was my footsteps on the creaky floorboards as I ventured deeper into the cavernous room. And that's when I saw them, sitting motionless in the rows, their pale faces turned toward the screen. No movement. No sound. Just the stillness of figures waiting for something. Waiting for me. I thought to myself it must be some odd, forgotten screening, maybe a special showing for the locals. But something felt deeply wrong. I took a tentative step forward, scanning the room. The rows of seats were filled with people, or at least, what looked like people. They were still, their eyes locked on the screen, but they did not stir. They weren't just quiet, they were frozen. I looked closer at their faces, ashen, expressionless, almost lifeless, their clothes tattered as if they had been sitting there for decades. Some of them wore old-fashioned attire, the kind you'd see in black and white films from the 1940s. Others were dressed in more recent styles, but their features were oddly blurred, as though their very existence had been dulled by time. I hesitated. The air felt thick, heavy. It was as if the silence pressed against me from all sides. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the creeping sense that something was wrong. But the curiosity gnawed at me, urging me to go on, to sit and see what the film was about. I chose a seat in the back row, the furthest from the staring, dead eyes of the audience. My fingers brushed the cracked armrest as I settled in. The velvet upholstery was frayed, and the once deep red color had faded into an unrecognizable shade of brown. The room was dim, save for the flickering light of the screen, which cast eerie shadows on the walls. Then, the film began. It started with grainy black and white footage, disjointed, almost too surreal to be a movie. I thought it was an old reel, perhaps a forgotten classic. The sound was completely absent. No music, no dialogue. Just the flickering images. I tried to focus on the scene, but something about it felt off. The film showed a street, deserted and quiet, with an unnerving stillness hanging in the air. The camera panned slowly, the lens capturing every small detail. A crumpled newspaper floated across the pavement, the edges fluttering in the wind. The figure on the screen, a lone person walking, caught my attention. Their face was unclear at first, the shot too far, too obscured by shadows. But as the figure moved closer into view, I felt a chill run down my spine. The person on the screen looked like me. I laughed nervously, thinking it was just a coincidence. After all, it was just an old movie. But the figure on the screen mirrored my every movement, my hurried pace, my uncertain expression. It was me. My heart skipped a beat. As I sat frozen, watching in disbelief, the scene shifted. The figure, was now running through the streets, breathless, as if something was chasing them. The world around them blurred, and the figure's movements became frantic, desperate. I could feel my pulse racing as the figure on the screen ran faster, their eyes wide with terror, darting from side to side, their footsteps echoing in the silent world. But then it hit me. The figure wasn't just running from something. They were running from me. I felt the breath catch in my throat as the film grew darker, the air in the theater thickening with a presence I couldn't explain. The audience, still silent, still staring at the screen, didn't move. But their eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, seemed to grow sharper, more focused. On me. The figure on the screen, still me, stumbled into an alley, the shadows growing longer, darker. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as the terror on the screen mirrored my own growing dread. I tried to look away, but the horror felt inescapable, the film pulling me deeper into its twisted grip. Then, I saw it. The first shadow. A dark, indistinct shape that seemed to shift with the movement of the film. As it grew closer to the figure on the screen, I felt a cold shiver wash over me. The figure didn't stop running. But the shadows kept growing, closing in, until they surrounded me, until they closed off every escape. I could see myself, or my past self gasping for air, eyes wide in terror as the shadowy forms closed in, their cold hands reaching for the figure's throat. Suddenly, the audience shifted. One of them, an old woman in a tattered dress, turned her head, and her eyes met mine. There was no life in them, no recognition. Just cold, empty stare. But in that moment, I knew. The people in the seats weren't watching a film. They were watching their own deaths unfold, played on that silent screen. They weren't just part of the audience, they had already lived the scenes they were seeing. They were dead. And as the scene on the screen reached its climax, I felt a sickening realization settle deep in my bones. I was about to be the next one to watch the final moments of my life. The film's final moments were agonizingly slow. The figure on the screen, me, was surrounded, backed into a corner. The shadowy figures closed in, their hands reaching, pulling, suffocating. And then, the final scream. The theater went silent again, and I realized that I had been holding my breath. As the film came to an end, I was frozen in place. The audience remained unmoving, their eyes locked on the screen, but something had changed. Their attention wasn't on the film anymore. It was on me. The silence pressed in from every side. The cold in the room was suffocating, thick with the weight of a truth I could no longer deny. The silent cinema wasn't just a theater. It was a place where the dead gathered to watch the films of their own fates, reliving their final moments over and over, waiting for others to join them. And as the lights flickered off, I realized, with bone-chilling certainty, my fate was already sealed. The next scene was mine. The audience didn't blink. They didn't move. But their eyes? They were waiting for me. I tried to move, to stand, to escape, but it was no use. My legs felt heavy, as if the very air in the theater had turned to concrete. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room was closing in around me, the shadows stretching out, consuming every inch of space. The audience, now a dark sea of lifeless faces, leaned forward in unison, their hollow gazes locking onto me. The screen flickered one last time, and I felt the air grow colder. My heartbeat quickened. The film was about to begin again. And this time, I would be the one on the screen.